Welcome to Chapter 7, Energy and Nutrient Relations. During this chapter, I'm going to talk about how the biosphere really captures energy from the sun and from some inorganic chemicals, and then passes that energy through the various trophic levels or feeding levels within the biosphere, and what some of the chemical composition and nutrient requirements are for these different feeding levels. And then finally, the fact that there is an energy limitation and that plants and animals have different strategies in order to deal with that limitation. And then we'll end up with the optimal foraging theory, one of my favorite theories, and we'll talk about how animals actually have a strategy to obtain energy in the most efficient way possible. The organisms, or plants and animals, that make up the biosphere can be classified into different categories, such as trophic levels or feeding levels. And the first group are the autotrophs. Auto meaning self and troph meaning feeding, so self-feeding organisms. And the first group, mainly plants, is the group that takes the energy from the sun and carbon dioxide from the air and uses the sun's energy to drive a chemical reaction that turns that CO2 into sugar. And those are the photosynthetic organisms. The chemosynthetic organisms, mainly bacteria, take inorganic molecules and extract the energy from those and also the carbon, and they build these organic molecules using that energy and that carbon source. Then the next major group of organisms, the heterotrophs, or other feeders, use the organic molecules that the autotrophs have built, and they get their energy from those, and then they extract the carbon from that and use that to build the various parts of their body. So basically we have a solar-powered biosphere, a biosphere that's driven by sunlight for the most part. And when we think about sunlight, I think you've probably learned somewhere along the line in a physics class that light comes in the form of particles or photons and also in waves. And the long wavelengths of light are low energy and the very short wavelengths are high energy. The low energy light is infrared energy, and that causes the Earth to heat up. So when we were talking earlier in this semester about how direct sunlight heats up that section of the Earth around the equator, that was this infrared long wavelength light energy that was doing that. It strikes materials on the Earth and causes the molecules to move a little bit faster, and that causes that material like rock or earth or water to heat up. The ultraviolet short wavelength section of the light spectrum that comes from the sun is much higher energy, and that can actually destroy some cells. You've probably heard that if you get too much ultraviolet radiation, you could suffer from cancer because of the destructive power of that. The light waves that are in between these two extremes are the light waves that plants use in order to do photosynthesis. So we call this the photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. And this radiation excites the molecules in pigments in plants, and then that energy is captured and it drives the photosynthetic reaction, turning the inorganic carbon dioxide into organic molecules like sugar. In figure 7.3 of your book, it shows you what happens with the photosynthetically active radiation that comes from the sun as it after it's passed through our atmosphere. A lot of it actually gets reflected in the atmosphere, but the portion that does make it through the atmosphere, when it hits the canopy of a forest, there's about 70% of it, or 79% of it, that gets used in that canopy in order to do photosynthesis. And then as you move down further, you can see that it's fairly small percentages that actually make it through. So a forest that has a really dense canopy has very little undergrowth in it. But in those areas where a tree has been knocked down, or there's been forest cutting of trees, forestry, in that area you'll see a lot more undergrowth going on. And in our area, the spring flowers come out in the forest before the leaves come out on the trees, and that's a time when there's more of this photosynthetically active radiation that's coming down to the undergrowth of the forest. Your book gets into a bit of detail with regard to measuring PAR in terms of photon flux density, and I'm not so interested in you really memorizing this section or knowing a lot about this. The main thing that I'd like you to understand about PAR is that it's the middle section of the spectrum of wavelengths of light that comes down to the earth from the sun, and that in this middle spectrum it's really the photons that are exciting the molecules in the pigments of plants that are causing this, allowing this energy to be released in order to build these organic molecules. And that this light absorption is affected by things like reflection of light from rocks, the landscape around plants, and the water. If plants are underwater, the amount of light that they're getting is decreased very, very quickly with depth. And also, if plants aren't able to extract enough water, like in the desert, then they're going to change their shape or their orientation towards the sun so that they lose less water, and that's going to impact how much of this PAR that they're able to absorb. And then the plants affect each other on this in terms of shading, as we talked about when we were looking at the diagram of the forest canopy. The photosynthetic pathway that most of you have learned in previous classes is the C3 photosynthetic pathway that's used by most plants and algae. And in this pathway, the plant takes in carbon dioxide, and then that reacts with ribulose biphosphate, RUBP, and forms two molecules of PGA, or phosphoglyceric acid. And then those two PGAs are then used in another subsequent reaction in order to produce sugar. Well, in this process, the plant has to open its stomata, or the holes in its leaves, in order to get that carbon dioxide in. And if this is happening in an area where water is scarce, then the plant is giving up, and it has a side effect of giving up water during the process of photosynthesis, and it's giving up water that it desperately needs. In figure 7.4 in your book, you see the C3 pathway diagrammed, and this is a really important part of this chapter because it shows the strategy that plants can develop through using different photosynthetic pathways in order to maximize their energy accumulation and reduce the water expenditure when they're in areas where water is very scarce. Plants that live in dry climates or arid environments often use a C4 photosynthesis process where the carbon dioxide inside the plant is moved over into a molecule called PEP, or phosphenyl pyruvate. It's a C4 molecule. That's where the C4 photosynthesis process comes from. And that reduces the concentration of CO2 inside the leaf, causing more CO2 to move in quickly. And that very quick movement of CO2 into the leaves allows the plant to have fewer stomata open, so then they don't lose so much water in that arid environment. Then that PEP is transferred over into a different cell, where then the process of producing PGA using RUBP is used as the CO2 is extracted from the PEP molecule. And that happens in cells called the bundle sheath cells. And the original extraction of the CO2 and movement into the PEP molecule happens in the mesophyll cells. The diagram of this process is provided in your book in figure 7.5. And again, this understanding the difference in this process from the C3 process and how it allows conservation of water is really important in understanding this chapter in ecology. Another photosynthetic pathway that's used to conserve water by succulent plants and does an even better job of conserving water is the CAM photosynthesis pathway. In this pathway, we have the same approach that was used by the C4 plants, where there's the movement of carbon dioxide into the plant, and then it's changed over right away into the PEP molecule. But in this case, that happens at night, and so the stomata are open only at night, and therefore during that time there's less water loss because the temperatures are reduced at night even in an arid environment. And so then the next sequence where this C4 acid is converted into PGA and is used in order to produce the sugars, then that process occurs during the day, where this light reaction can be driven by the sunlight that's available. So this CAM method allows a much better conservation of water and is another important aspect of the survival of plants. A diagram of this process is shown in figure 7.6 in your book and gives you a good idea of how this process occurs and saves the plant's water. As I mentioned in the introduction, plants aren't the only autotrophs that we have in our biosphere. Exploration that was done in small submarines on the ocean floor came across a fascinating ecosystem associated with the geothermal vents on the ocean floor, where sulfide-rich warm water was discharging into the water column, and there they found these chemosynthetic bacteria that were using this sulfide and in a symbiotic relationship with these very large ocean worms in order to establish the basis of a community that had a variety of heterotrophs associated with it. And so we have bacteria that are really autotrophs in terms of chemosynthesis and extracting energy from inorganic molecules such as ammonia, nitrite, iron, hydrogen, and the sulfide that become a very important part of our biosphere. Now we move into an area that might be a little bit more familiar territory for you. We're talking about the heterotrophs. And here we encounter the different feeding levels. We have herbivores, and they feed on herbs or plants, and carnivores. If any of you know Spanish, carne is the word for meat, and so carnivores is derived from that, and it's those animals that feed on animal flesh. And then we have just a huge community of detritivores, and these are the organisms that break down organic material and keep us from a situation where we're wading around in garbage all the time. In order to understand the feeding processes at these different levels, we need to start by understanding what the chemical composition of plants and animals actually is. And it's interesting to see that the majority is made up of just 5 different elements. We have carbon, and you think this is the basic building block for organisms. We call ourselves carbon-based organisms because of that. And oxygen is used in the process of metabolism, where oxygen is used in this the whole variety of metabolic processes that break down organic molecules and release energy. And then hydrogen is used in order to carry electrons from one place to another, these high energy electrons. And then nitrogen is the basic building block for proteins, and phosphorus is used extensively in cells. If you think about the phospholipid layer that you learned about in cell biology, you realize how important phosphorus can be, and also for the basic structure of DNA. Plants also extract other essential nutrients in very small quantities from the soil, and these nutrients are also critical for heterotrophs, even though they occur in very small quantities. Herbivores face some real challenges in that there isn't very much nitrogen in many of the plants that they eat, and since nitrogen is a basic building block for proteins, this can really result in them having to eat a huge volume of plants in order to get the amount of nitrogen that they need. In addition, they have to overcome a wide variety of physical and chemical defenses that plants have developed so that they won't be eaten. Things like thorns and prickers and various chemicals that causes stinging. If you've ever come across stinging nettles, you know how painful that can be. And then the cellulose that plants have is almost indigestible and requires a special microfauna in the digestive tract of some herbivores in order to break that down. And some plants are just plain poisonous and can kill an animal if they're eaten. The detritivores are those animals that eat dead plant material, face a similar problem, or even greater in terms of getting nitrogen, because much of the nitrogen leaches out of plant material once it dies. And so leaves, for example, have half the nitrogen that they had when they were still attached to the tree. So these detritivores, which are essential to removing a lot of the organic debris that we have around us, are still facing major problems, some of the same major problems that the herbivores do. The carnivores, although they have very rich food to eat, they do have some problems in choosing their prey because the prey have defenses to prevent predation. Some of the animals, as you well know, have color patterns that tell you right away that they're poisonous. And for example, the monarch butterfly is noxious. It tastes really, really bad, and so when birds eat a monarch, they tend to regurgitate it, and then the next monarch they see, they probably won't eat. And so then the animals will mimic this. Some harmless animals will mimic some of the noxious animals in a what's called Batesian mimicry so that they don't get eaten. And then those that are poisonous tend to take on similar coloration like orange and black, or some bright colors for the poison arrow frogs, in order to warn the predators that this whole group is something you should avoid. So the carnivores, which are predators, really become agents of natural selection, so that as they pick off those individuals in a population that don't have this really bright coloration or some other defensive mechanism, they're then causing a selection for these predator avoidance behaviors or chemicals or structures. And so there's this constant battle going on between predators and prey through the mechanisms associated with natural selection. One example is the bat and the tiger moth, where the tiger moth can detect the bat's sonar emissions, and it folds up its wings and drops real quick. Well, then the bat learns that and starts to aim lower, and then the tiger moth developed a mechanism to jam the sonar of the bat, and then the bat is working to overcome that, and it just goes on and on. Now there is a limit to how much energy plants and animals can take in. When you think of plants, the photon flux density actually gets to a point where the plants can't react to that any further. And in terms of animals, animals can get to the point where they're full and they just can't eat anymore, even though the food is available. A plant's reaction to the photon flux density varies as the light intensity. So at low light, there's a linear response, and then as the light increases, the level of response decreases, and finally at very high light intensities, it actually levels off and is flat in response. And we see this differs from different species of plants. An example in your book in figure 7.21 was a comparison between the response of a fern to the light intensity compared to a desert shrub, and the fern is adapted to a low light environment. So when the photon flux intensity got to a certain level, it just could not respond any further to that, whereas the desert plant, which is more adapted to high intensities of light, was able to. An ecologist by the name of Holling looked at how animals might respond to increasing density of foods, and he developed basically 3 types of feeding rate responses. And in these, he saw that perhaps animals might respond by having just a linear response where there was increased feeding rate as the density of prey increased, and This is reflected in small creatures like filtering worms in a marine environment that are eating very small food. The type 2 prey response, there's initial increase, and then about midway it decreases a bit as prey density increases and eventually levels off. And then the type 3 response, initially there's a slow increase in the feeding rate, and then it speeds up in the mid-ranges quite a bit and then levels off quickly at a certain prey density. As researchers investigated animals and looked at the possibilities, they saw that the type 2 response was the one that they found most often in the natural environment. So the last section we get into is the optimal foraging theory. In this case, we're talking about how animals have to reduce in some area of their lives if resources are limited. And in most instances, resources are very limiting. For example, if resources are limited in a particular year, a breeding pair of birds may not produce as many offspring that year, so that those offspring would be able to survive. So in that way, the birds are giving up on a high level of reproduction because of the limited nutrients, and instead they're focusing their efforts on providing sufficient nutrients for a smaller number of offspring. So based on optimal foraging theory, as prey density increases, animals should be getting a larger energy return from that. But they really need to consider the time that it takes to search for the prey and the amount of time that it takes and energy that it takes to handle the prey. And then they need to maximize that or balance that so that they're sure that they're getting enough energy back from the prey in order to support the energy expenditure that they had in searching for and handling the prey. One of the studies that your book talks about in terms of the use of this model, the optimal foraging theory model, was a study done by Werner in Middleback. And here they were studying bluegills. This is a particularly interesting study for me because I worked with Dr. Werner near the end of my undergraduate program on these ponds that they used for this study. And what Dr. Werner found out from this was that the available prey in the ponds, which was mainly zooplankton, was quite small. But the prey that the bluegills optimally took was in the middle size range because they got enough energy back from that size in order to compensate for their handling and search times. So the model actually predicted that, and then when they went out and measured that in these 10 ponds, which were exactly the same size and structure, they were able to really prove that this theory actually works. And so we can use this theory in terms of managing animals and understanding the types of prey that they need and the levels of prey that they may take so that we can better provide an environment that's suitable for them. For example, the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone had an impact on the elk herd, and they were able to predict to what extent that would impact the elk herd and then manage both of those populations accordingly. The same optimal foraging theory applies to plants as well, in that plants allocate more to roots in a situation where water is limited, and then they may allocate more to the upper portion of the plant, which includes their leaves, in situations where sunlight is limited. If you look at the size of leaves of plants in the lower part of a forest compared to the size of the leaves of the trees that are up in the upper canopy, you can really see this. It's a good example of this optimal foraging theory in plants.